insightful and inspiring speech. And now we have our time for discussions and questions, so please be active.
That was so rich, I can hardly respond to a small piece of it. Thank you so much. I look forward to reading it. In Vilnius this past week, there was the latest monument, which is on Vilnius Street, and it's a brass belly with a belly button. I don't know how many people have seen that. Well, the belly button is a scar of the very first trauma of birth on our bodies, but we pay very little attention to it. What I'm thinking of regarding Bloom, you mentioned that Joyce had a libretto by a guy, written by a guy, Bloom. But of course, the most outstanding feature of Bloom is that he's Jewish. Now, one of the most outstanding features of Jews, as the big trauma of Nazism showed, was the scar of circumcision. So I'm thinking that one would have to go on to speak of the difference between the narrative response to scar and the body scarring, which you find in many cases in tribes in Africa, you find it in all Muslims, you find it in all Jews, and the relation of those significations, in which case it would be very interesting, I think, to compare Joyce's Ulysses with Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. Just a suggestion.
A great suggestion. And of course, you're absolutely right about the name Bloom being much more than Blum, who happened to be Jewish as well, the librettist of the opera. It was the nachhaltig triggering of the memory of being rescued by the Jewish hunter, a Jew called Hunter, who was a real historical character. Now, Joyce could have called his character Hunter. He does take the name Eccles Street, the same street, but he changes the name from Hunter to Bloom. And yeah, it's very interesting about the scarrings, that it's in his moment of being scarred and beaten up a second time that Joyce remembers the first time, and the first time he was rescued by a cuckolded Jew, right? Probably one of the most rejected and ridiculed people in Dublin was the person who came to rescue him and dust him down in true Samaritan fashion. So it's the Jew who is the Samaritan. And perhaps implied in that, I mean, there is the scarring of Bloom being betrayed, and Hunter being betrayed, and ridiculed publicly, but also of being an immigrant who had great difficulty assimilating or integrating or dwelling in Dublin at the time. There was a pogrom in Limerick in 1904, and Joyce, you know, cut out the newspaper and had his sister sent it to him, and you know, that also went into it. So the cutting of Bloom in many respects, the cutting off, the cutting out, but the cutting of circumcision is a very interesting one. I've never thought about that, but in any case, Joyce's woundedness bonded with the woundedness of the cuckolded circumcised Jew. And of course, Derrida, as many of you will know, in his work on circonfession as circumfession, so narrative, imagination and memory in the confession, Derrida's confession repeating Augustine's confessions, but also circonfession being circumcision. So circumcision and circumfession is a confessing, a re-narrating of the wound. In the case of Derrida, his own circumcision as a Jew, and Paul Celan also had quite a lot to say on the scar and the wound and the cut as trauma, which would be very relevant to this debate also. So thank you for that. And the Merchant of Venice, never thought of that connection, but there's the pound of flesh and the cutting and lots of things to be said there.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation, and I say for presentation of the case of repetition, which I will talk about also. And when I listened to your talk, and when I read your book, I often think about possibility of religiousness of repetition. I think it is the main problem of your book of anatheism. And this case of repetition also deals with this problem, but not in the direct way. How can you explain this interconnection between the religious experience and experience as repetition? Because it's very important.
Well, I agree with you. It seems to be a paradigmatic, essential function of the psyche, repetition, as I think Freud and depth kind of psychoanalysis has taught us. But it's also a paradigmatic and forwardly, and maybe more fundamentally, a paradigmatic structure of religion. And in anatheism, the example I take in terms of the repetition of the wound in the story is the Primal Scene, just for those who don't know the book. I know Rita has read it, but most of you haven't. Of the founding of the great wisdom traditions on a moment of violence and hostility that is turned into hospitality. So taking the root hostis, which can mean either enemy or guest, there is a wager, which is the inaugural act of all great religions, I think, to turn the enemy into a guest, therefore to do the impossible. Right? Now, in doing that, Abraham, therefore, when he greets the three strangers under the Mamre tree, the tree at Mamre, is turning what could be murderers who come out of the desert, out of nowhere, into a god. Because it's when he gives them food and kneels at their feet that they reveal themselves not as murderers and as enemies, but the hostis proves to be the guest. So the impossible happens, and this is an inaugural moment in all religions. And it's repeated from one religion to the next. And in fact, throughout the Torah, you find that inaugural moment of hospitality is repeated again and again, because if it's not repeated forward, it leads to an acting out. Right? In other words, the moment of conversion from hostility to hospitality, the impossible act of the stranger becoming a god and being revealed as a god, is not something that happens once and for all. And we're all redeemed, you know, we're all washed in the blood of the Lamb, as we Christians might say. No, it has to go on again and again. So, I mean, just after Abraham makes that wager and turns hostility into hospitality, what happens? Well, he kicks his son and Hagar out into the desert, and then there's Sodom and Gomorrah and all kinds of dreadful things. So it's something that has to be returned to and repeated. And then in Christianity, and that's in a way my argument, you get not in any progressive or supersessionist sense, a repetition of the stranger arriving to the Nazarene, the Nazarena, and the conversion of fear. Her first experience is one of fear and hostility. She is troubled, diaterectai, she is troubled, but she makes a wager, dialogissima, she ponders, makes a wager that this could be a bringer of the impossible, and so she has a son, just as Sarah had a son by accepting the stranger, who could be an enemy, and converting, if you will, by an act of love, the enemy impossibly into a divine stranger. And it happens in Islam, as I've tried to argue, and so on and so forth. So Anna is the repetition always, and again, I'm not talking about a supersessionist teleological Hegelian theodicy, we're all heading towards the final kingdom, but it's that need to come back, because the wound, we're never done with the wound. We're never done. You know, we might have thought after the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and, you know, Western civic democracy and so on, that we had reached the end of history, the end of art, you know, believe Hegel or Fukuyama, but we had the 20th century. And after that, we can't believe that religion comes, I mean, religion or any form of enlightenment or healing definitively. So The hostility is always there, it always returns, and therefore we need to keep coming back to it. Which is why, in a way, Hamlet is a failed play because it's a play that cannot end. That's its greatness. Ulysses is a book that cannot end. That's its greatness. And religion should be religions that can never end. And the moment they say, that's it, we have it, we can now close the doors, we got the truth, nobody else does, that is hospitality betraying itself, an initial, inaugural mission of hospitality, or memory of hospitality, betraying itself as hostility. And the worst form of hostility is, the corruption of the best. The corruption of the best is the worst. So religion, which I think can bring about that repetition healing, which is always partial, never final, can also be the worst perpetrator of the wounds.
In your book, you show how Derrida and other thinkers substituted the picture of the mirror with that of the mirroring, led to vertical mirrors, which is distinguished by the fact that you see both the image and the world, the empirical world, which embeds that image, and you see them simultaneously. There's no bipolarity between them. You can see both my image and the object which reflects my image simultaneously. When you talk about those stories within stories in Hamlet, Joyce, Oedipus, this is the type maybe of being cured from trauma, that I'm not negating the trauma, and I let it be as a plenitude, but at the same time it's simultaneous with another plenitude, which is other possibility, the world where I'm fully and healthy. And this also perhaps a question which you posed about what we call the big traumas, rape, genocide, etc. I mean, nobody comes to heal it, to eradicate it. It stays a plenitude, but at the same time it will be simultaneous with another plenitude.
Yeah, I fully agree. I don't know which book I mentioned this in.
Which book?
Yeah.
The book about which are your
The Wake of Imagination.
Wake of Imagination.
I thought maybe it was a book I hadn't written, because I don't recognize the passage. But I've got a very bad memory. In any case, I think I get the point. And the plenitude, the irredeemable, unspeakable plenitude of the wound that can never go away. The wound never goes away, right? And to pretend that it could go away or could be wished away or covered up is actually to do it a great disservice. And a lot of the work, some people say, well, why do we have to remember Auschwitz and remember genocides and the Irish famine or whatever, particularly? Because if you don't, then it's going to come back and repeat itself disastrously. If you don't do the work of mourning, the work of remembering, then it will dispense with you, and it will catch up with you, and it will act itself out compulsively in all forms of violence. So, the idea, let's forgive and forget, and to hell with narrative memory, well, that's what these authors are saying you cannot do. Because if you do that, it comes back as fate. You have to repeat forward, through narrative imagination, and other ways too, to give a future to the past, so that it's not the past repeating itself in this deadening revenge and resentment cycle. So the counter-plenitude, right, would be the realm of possibility, opened up, as one works with the wound. And that's where the scar comes in, and that's where writing as diagnostics comes in, right, and as prognostics. It's that in addressing the wound that remains invisible, unimaginable, unspeakable, unthinkable, unexperienceable, as a gap and a void, a nihil, the response is to actually create this imagined realm of possibilities. And that is the realm of the scar. The scar already is a form of writing. And to retrieve the scar as it is a trace of the wound, and to reconfigure and refigure the scar in writing, that's where there can be the second plenitude. But it's of the order of imagination, right? And there's a surplus of suffering that can never be exhausted, inherited from our traumas. And there's a surplus of meaning, what Ricoeur calls, eschatological or utopian meaning, which provokes semantic innovation. And no text can ever exhaust that. So you can't exhaust the trauma of the past, and you can't exhaust the promise of the future. And caught between those two inexhaustible middles, right, you have the miracle of writing, or what Proust called le petit miracle, of writing, or the sonata, or people exchanging stories. You don't have to be a Proust or a Joyce or a Shakespeare to be cured by writing. In fact, I don't think they were terribly cured. Certainly Joyce wasn't. But I think Jung was right when he said that if he hadn't written Ulysses, he would have ended up in an asylum. I think that's absolutely true. He was saved from psychosis, from the pathology of psychosis, by his writing. He was a creative psychotic, as opposed to a pathological psychotic, which doesn't carry any culpability. It carries tragedy and pain. So we suffer less pain by reading in the second fullness, as you call it. But it's never a happiness that trumps pain or gets rid of suffering.
If I may ask a question here, because it seems very deep what you just said. You mentioned some foundational stories, and I know in your book on hermeneutical imagination, you also gave plenty of analysis on false consciousness and on the stories that were criticized by the whole tradition, starting from Marx and Nietzsche and going to French postmodern tradition, as being narratives which are used to manipulate societies and to manipulate minds. So, what would be the borderline between the story as a healing and the story as manipulation? You gave an interesting example, the Lansman and Spielberg confrontation, which may not be the Spielberg's case. You can discuss about that, but anyway, having in mind what has been said about Adorno and the impact of Hollywood on the consciousness, which is a manipulation, exactly, with the substituting imagination with transcendental schematism. What measure could be taken to distinguish the type of a story or to recognize the ability to heal and not to be manipulated?
Well, it's a great question, and hermeneutically it's where we have to draw on, for example, Ricoeur's distinction between hermeneutics of suspicion and hermeneutics of affirmation. And I don't think there's such a thing as a pure story versus an impure story, except in certain instances. I think we can probably say that Joyce's Ulysses is a pretty pure story compared to Hitler's Mein Kampf. Right? So it's not like this is relativism. There are variations in that spectrum of narratives that disable and narratives that enable, narratives that incarcerate, narratives that emancipate, narratives that are on the side of Eros and narratives that are on the side of Thanatos. But even the narratives that are on the side of the good can be manipulated. I mean, look what people have done with the great Celtic myths, the Nordic myths. Hinder went around with a copy of the Appalachian stories in his back pocket. So you can take the holiest story, look what religions have done with the Gospels and the Abrahamic. So, if you like, the most healing and therapeutic and salvific of stories can be manipulated for all kinds of abuse and domination. So it's never a question of saying, well, now we can engage in a hermeneutic of affirmation and dispense with the hermeneutic of suspicion. They're always, the potential for the misreadings of texts is huge. I mean, look at the misreading of Joyce's Ulysses by the judges who banned it. They thought it was a work of pornography. That's a misreading of the book. But that's what can happen to a book. And somebody, a pornographer, might go along, if he believed the judges who censored the book initially in the 1930s, and say, hey, I'll sell you this, it's forbidden porn, you know, I'll give it to you for £1. So Ulysses can be misused as pornography, or Homer could be, you know, you could take Ajax killing, you know, 600 Trojans and say, hey, this is a pretty good, you know, good for our neo-Nazi reading room. So any text, no text is invulnerable or pure in that sense. There's always a conflict of interpretation. But within that spectrum, I think we can definitely say there are certain great works of literature that are trying to work through this question of trauma and healing, and others that are clearly not. Mein Kampf is certainly one that is not. To come back briefly to what you say about the Spielberg Lanzmann debate and Adorno. All right, so Adorno says, as you all know, after Auschwitz, who can write poetry? Well, if we can't write poetry, in other words, if Paul Celan isn't even allowed, then who can tell stories? Nobody. So it's actually a nonsense, because if you were to follow Adorno on that, but I mean, we understand what he means. It just means you don't go on telling stories as if nothing happened, I think. But if you were to take it literally, then the Nazis would win. And Levinas makes an interesting point about that. And Levinas has lots to say about the difficulty of remembering and the immemorial and so on. But his second great book, Autrement qu'être, is dedicated to the memory of those who died. And at one point, I can't remember the exact text, maybe Richard, you will remember it. He says, if we do not speak of the Holocaust and do not remember it, then the Nazis have won. Because what the Nazis swore the SS stormtroopers and the SS officers to silence. Swansea Convention, that was it. Nobody will speak about the Holocaust. So if then you say, okay, Adorno, who of course is on the other side, 100% on the other side, silence, and you've got a silence because nobody must find out what happened, the Nazi silence, versus Adorno's aesthetic silence. Nobody can talk about this because to put it into words is already to portray the horror, the unspeakable horror of that singular, unique, irrepresentable event. They're actually curiously in collusion, not intentionally so. So stories have to be written. And Primo Levi, you know, is very, 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 very insistent on this. He said the need to tell the story, coming back to your point here, again and again and again. Anna, 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 Anna Mises. He said, took hold of me like an alimentary need, like food. Not just an elementary, but an alimentary need. And he said, I had to go on telling this story because it was the food that kept me alive, and it was the food that would stop it hopefully ever happening again. I have to go on telling the story until it, so that people will remember and so that it doesn't happen again. And when he'd done it for the 8th or 9th time, he went up to the 5th story of his apartment in Turin. I think it was Gianni Vattimo who actually showed me the building when I was with him years ago in Turin, and he jumped off, and that was the end. He'd done his duty. But what had kept him alive was the need to tell the story again and again and again. And Elie Wiesel and many of the other Holocaust narrators will tell you the same thing. It's awful to go back to that trauma. It's so painful. But it's an injunction. Remember me, remember me, remember me. Now, a word, and no more than a word, because I've already spoken a lot today, about the Spielberg-Lanzmann controversy. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but I tried to deal with it in the 3rd chapter of On Stories, and it's very complex. But basically, Lanzmann, I can summarize it a little, I mentioned it in the paper, said, look, the only way of doing this cinematically is real-life interviewers with the perpetrators and the survivors. Black and white, I will show Cinéma Vérité, dead-on interviews, and mostly what will work here is their inability to speak. When they break down, when the face goes off camera, when they shudder, when they touch their throats, that's how they will betray, in the sense that they will show what cannot be said, if we want to quote Wittgenstein, right? They will show what cannot be said. And it'll be 8 hours, and it'll be unwatchable. And we'll show it in conditions that are virtually impossible. And this is what he did. And it was shown, and some of you may have seen it, at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning on BBC or PBS or Arte. Because if you're to show a film 8 hours on the trot, there aren't many even public broadcasting, forget the private broadcasters, who can take 8 hours to do that. So apart from that, it was then shown in certain art house cinemas and in certain kind of discussion groups about, but it didn't get out to people. It wasn't seen by 99.9% of people who should have seen it, right? But it was aesthetically and ethically sensitive to a resistance to fiction, a resistance to dramatization, and a resistance to catharsis. No colour, no fictional characters, no dramaturgy. Then along comes Spielberg and says he wants to do the same thing. He's also, you know, a son of Jewish survivors and what. And so he makes Schindler's List. And Lanzmann goes for him and says, you have betrayed the very essence and the very truth of this unspeakable, unrepresentable event by, you know, taking Hollywood actors, using colour and technicolor and telling this great story and giving us lots of catharsis. And Spielberg's response was, you know, I'm certainly not a defender of Hollywood, far from it. But I think he had a very important point. I'm not saying who was right or wrong in the debate. And it was this: the film I've made will be seen by millions of people who need to see it. It caused such a controversy in America, it was discussed in the House of Representatives and became mandatory in school discussions, where it was discovered that 68% of American students between the age of, you know, entering school to the age of 17 had not heard of the Holocaust. In Germany, where it was shown, the figures were almost as bad. And people went to see it, and it caused huge discussion at all kinds of levels. So in terms of communicating the event, it did what Spielberg wanted it to do, even though it did deploy certain aesthetic strategies and narrative strategies that perhaps did not fully respect the unspeakability of the event itself. So in that sense, you might say that Spielberg, his fidelity was primarily to the communicability of the event. Lanzmann to the uncommunicability of the event. And they're both right in their respective ways. But I can see how, from a therapeutic point of view, i.e. you don't cure the Holocaust, but you, maybe I should say pedagogical point of view, it was a much more effective film. And at the same time, Spielberg did set up these memory archives where people went in as survivors and told their story in the dark. They were recorded for posterity. It was not public, it was one-to-one, so that those who were dying without having told their story were enabled to do so in privacy. And many people, you know, traumatized victims, said, we can't talk about this in public. If we do, we will die. And 3 of Lanzmann's interlocutors committed suicide because bringing it back up in front of a camera, having to tell the story like that, they weren't ready for it. And so the 2 parts of themselves, if you want the conscious and the unconscious, the then and the now, when brought into collision in that way, they simply weren't able to translate. And so they broke down and 3 committed suicide. Now, nobody's going to blame Lanzmann for that, but they felt they had a duty to tell it. But telling it in public in a way that they couldn't brought about that revisiting of the trauma, which didn't have scar tissue there to allow it to be translated and written and spoken. So it's a very interesting one. And just to end with a final little anecdote, I remember giving a lecture on this very question in McGill University some years ago, and at the end of the discussion, it was on politics of memory, this little old woman came up to me and she said, you know, I was on the train, I was on Schindler's List. And I said, oh, well, I'm delighted to meet you. And she said, you know, when I came out, when I survived the Holocaust, I went to Israel and then finally to New York, I never spoke to anybody. Not my husband, or my brothers and sisters, not my children, nobody. And it was only when I went to see the movie, and I didn't really even know what it was about, But when I went to see the movie and suddenly I saw myself being played by a fictional character, I went back there and I relived it through the detour of narrative imagination, through the detour of fiction. I was living it as if it was me. And it was her, but it was played by somebody else. And in that way she had what Aristotle might call catharsis, pity and fear. She was able to identify with the suffering, with her own suffering, but also she had phobos. She had the serenity, purged fear becomes serenity, to detachment, healthy detachment, to witness herself from a distance. What Joyce calls in his analysis of catharsis, an understanding of the hidden cause. She was now able to stand back and see it. So she was herself there on screen, and she was also not herself. And that herself, not herself, brought about, in her own account, a certain healing. So the role of fiction and narrative in the retelling of history seems to me to be very important, because history claims, and rightly so, it has truth claims to tell it as it happened. Fiction aims to tell it as if it happened in this way or that way, or as if you are the person suffering or acting in that way. And I think sometimes a combination of the two is absolutely necessary. And I think to some extent, you know, Michelet is a history written with very powerful fictional elements of the French Revolution. Simon Schama's history of the French Revolution, likewise, you know, extraordinary literary tropes, characterizations, plot twists, point of view. And then you find great works of fiction, like Ulysses, which you think are pure fiction, and then you read Joyce's letters and diaries, and you realize every single word in it was heard or overheard in some pub or brothel or street or lecture theatre or whatever. And you realize, as Joyce said, would be a brave man would invent something that never happened. So fiction borrows from history, history borrows from fiction, and the overlap very often is important. And that's where, to come back to your point about Lanzmann and Spielberg, I think there's a whole debate there to be continued.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. And what surprised me very much was the humanization of trauma. And the idea that victimization and rehabilitation is the condition of catharsis.
Can you talk a little? I've got a band competing here and some machine that's buzzing. So I think I heard most of it, but
You may come closer.
What surprised me very much was the romanticization of trauma.
yeah.
And the idea that victimization is a condition of catharsis.
Victimization. Is it?
Victimization.
Victimization.
If it is an idea, I would like to disagree a little bit with it. And trauma studies are very interesting, but I think that trauma discourse is a leaking concept, actually.
Leaky.
Leaking.
Leaky.
Leaking. It is very useful to be victimized and to lament. It is comfortable situation and comfortable position. I can make an example. For instance, in post-communist countries and some other countries with difficult past, when they are entering the Western culture, they are becoming independent and open countries, the artifacts of culture normally uses post-communist trauma images. And this is the price for entering to the Western market. I mean that reality is much more cruel than your romanticized position.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a very interesting point. First of all, I would not at all want to suggest that catharsis is only linked to victimization. It's also linked to the perpetrator. Odysseus is not just the receiver of pain, he is the giver of pain. So that our identification with a character like Odysseus is an identification through pity and fear of somebody who is like us and not like us. In the reception of pain, we're all victims, we're all traumatized by birth and by loss and by separation. Unfortunately, most of us, I hope, have not endured Holocaust, rape, war, trauma, or worse. So us going around with our mini traumas, our little traumas, which I think is the human condition, we all experience the traumatisme original, the original trauma, make us people who can have alias, pity, compassion for those who suffer. By the same token, we are agents of pain. We inflict pain. And the characters of tragedy are not saints. The tragedies of tragedy are not victims. They are also perpetrators of suffering. Hamlet is not a very nice guy. Look at how he behaves with Ophelia. If there's anybody a victim in the story, it's Ophelia. It's not Hamlet, right? Stephen Dedalus is an appalling narcissist, right? He's not just a victim visited by ghosts. He actually is a giant egomaniac who wants to write the greatest work of literature ever written. Well, we know that his author went on to do that. So what I'm saying, and Odysseus is the manipulator, the deceiver par excellence. So catharsis and identification with characters in and through catharsis is not at all about, pure good or pure evil. That's comedy. Tragedy is about the mix, the middle between acting and suffering, victimization and perpetration. And I mean, what's very important and very practical now, look at the truth tribunals. It's not just the victims who need to have their story heard and recognized. That's essential. It's the perpetrators, it's the torturers who have hidden this from themselves, and there can be no pardon, no healing, no moving forward until they acknowledge what they did. So catharsis works both ways. Victimization is only one part of it, and if one gets caught in victimization, I couldn't agree with you more, you end up with the very kind of pathologies that you described.
Okay, more questions? Maybe I would have one more question. You mentioned the book by Auerbach,
Yeah.
and the episode of Odysseus, who is recognized by Telemachus, and the scar, which is very important. And the explanation done by Homer, which is 70-something lines long. And this this approach, literary approach, is juxtaposed by Auerbach with another way of telling stories, which is a biblical way, the Abraham story, basically, which is pretty silent in a way that you don't get to know too many details. And then you mentioned Hamlet and Ulysses as endless projects, endless texts. So what would be maybe the question of quantity and quality in this case? Would you have a suggestion how the story should be told, having in mind this Auerbach's juxtaposition?
Well, as I understand and recall Auerbach, and I may be wrong, even if I'm wrong, I'll make the point anyway, which I hope is valid. Where the biblical and religious stories, coming back to Rita's point also, sometimes can fail is in lacking mimesis, that is, attention to singular, particular, irrelevant, idiosyncratic detail. And actually, if one reads a number of biblical stories, there is incredible detail. But assuming for now that there isn't the same realism, mimetic realism that Auerbach praises in Western Greek literature, going from tragedy to the modern novel, it's the duty of people who are interested in religion to translate it into particularity. So, Mount Moriah, it's kind of 5 lines. It's very boring in the Bible. But you read Kierkegaard, woof, does it come to life? 5 ways or 4 ways of retelling what goes on in the mind of Kierkegaard, of Abraham? That's interesting. Or even Derrida, I'm going with philosophers now, I haven't even gone to literature yet. In The Gift of Death, the way he gets into the mind of Abraham. And then, of course, the holy stories that are told as the saints reinterpret Abraham and reinterpret Jesus well, the painters. And what's the Annunciation? It's 5 lines in St. Luke, with one sentence that tells us how Mary phenomenologically experienced the stranger. Directa dialogissima. She was troubled and pondered. But look at the paintings, look at Botticelli, look at De Massimo, look at the countless representations in imagination of what was going on in her mind. Absolutely extraordinary. And look at the literary representations of what was going on in her mind, soul, and body. Then religion is saved by narrative imagination. Pictorial, cinematic, literary. And it tends to cut that off. And it's not just the Muslims, Islamic fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists put bombs into the cinemas in Paris when Kazanzaki's Last Temptation of Christ was being shown. Now, The Last Temptation of Christ is a perfect example of Auerbach's mimesis, because it tries to get into Christ's mind as he's on the crucifix, and he imagines what life would be like if he didn't have to die, and if he lived a normal life as a normal Jew, and he had children and work, but it's a temptation. He doesn't go there, he can't go there, but it reveals to us the humanity and tragedy of Jesus. Just as, I remember Ricard telling me once, and he'd read in a short story, that Jesus can't forgive his enemies. He's got to ask God to forgive them. Why? Because his humanity cannot forgive somebody who's torturing him. Who could do that? Nobody. God is the word we give for doing the impossible. For giving us a child when we can't have it. Sarah has an impossible child, Mary has an impossible child, etc., etc. It's a word we give to the miracle of the impossible becoming possible. And ditto for forgiveness. Forgiveness is impossible for those who've tortured you, unless God can forgive, but no human being can forgive that. It's impossible. So when we get into the humanity of Jesus, an example I love, again it would make for a lovely short story, is, and forgive me talking so much about Jesus, but that's the story I know best as a Christian, but Jesus when he's confronted by the Phoenician woman, right? And we hear so many versions of Jesus, creeping Jesus who would do anything to please us, holy Jesus, boring, boring, boring. Where's the mimesis? Where's the reality of the human in the divine? It's not a question of getting rid of the divine, but let's hear about the human. And when the Phoenician woman comes and she says, when you hear me, just get lost. You're not one of us. You don't belong to my group. And she said, but you give crumbs to the dogs. Just treat me as a dog. He says, well, that's a good point. I'm treating you worse than a dog. Okay, here's some crumbs. But that's an apprenticeship, So it's those kind of details that painters pick up on, that filmmakers pick up on, that novelists and poets pick up on. And they can, Jared Manley Hopkins, Joyce, they can be Christian writers, not evangelists, because that's not good art. But they can be deeply imbued with the story and have a real reverence for the story. But they've got to allow the particularity, the contingency, who was talking about the contingency of the image earlier, the ambiguity, the richness. That's what Auerbach felt was there in Odysseus' scar, and maybe not in Jacob's scar after he wrestled with the angel, or Jesus' scar when he comes back after his resurrection. In fact, there was a huge controversy in kind of Reformed theology where Calvin and his peers were arguing, but Christ's wounds, and Calvin said, well, the risen Christ, the resurrected Christ, can't have wounds because he's perfect, and you've got to get rid of those wounds. That's a sign of finitude and mortality and humanity in a way. And so, no, Auerbach would say, and I agree with him, you've got to use narrative imagination to restore the wounds, restore the scars, keep the scars, because if you don't, then you've got idolatry.
Thank you. More questions? Please, Orion.
I would like to go back to this controversy between Lanzmann and Spielberg, and maybe to complicate it a little bit by introducing 2 more players. One would be Roberto Benigni's film Life is Beautiful, and another one could be Kiki Huckermann's photographs, Memoirs de Camp, which were exhibited in St.
For photographs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard about it, but I haven't seen them.
Also, she's written a book where images inspired.
Yeah. Well, this is where I could learn more from you, because I'm sure you have a lot to say about that, and please say it. Because I haven't read D.B. Huckermann, but I've read of him, and little articles, but I haven't read them as I would like to. But I would certainly, that's homework for me, and I'd like to go into that. And as for Life is Beautiful, it's not one I have gone into, but it's an interesting. I'm not sure at this late hour I really want to take on that one, either to condemn it or to defend it, because it goes further than Schindler's List. You know, Auschwitz is beautiful, but of course we know that's not what he means at all. In fact, he takes that quotation from Effie Hillison, who was in the camps shortly in her diary before she died. She said life was beautiful. And, you know, there you enter the realm of the unspeakable. Either she was a psychotic or a saint. And if you read An Interrupted Life, it's hard not to think she was actually a saint. Who could say that in a certain, but it's totally incomprehensible. It's impossible. No human being can kind of say that. And the layers of humor and irony and contradiction, of course, in the film are such that you know, life is beautiful goes with lots of quotation marks, right? But as I say, I don't really want to take it on because it's charged, but very important as an example. And I would say probably many people who went to see that film learned a lot about the Holocaust in a way they may not have otherwise. And it's a very tragic story. The question might be, well, does it offer redemption? And if it does, can there be a redemptive narrative of Auschwitz? And I think the answer should be no. It shouldn't be. There cannot be a redemptive narrative of Auschwitz. But a cathartic narrative, and it definitely is, tragic catharsis. Life is Beautiful is tragic catharsis. There I think a case can be made, both for Life is Beautiful and for Schindler's List. But catharsis is not closure, is not resolution, is not a healing of the wound. It's a keeping it going by narrating it. It's a way of remembering what otherwise cannot be remembered. So, thank you for the question, and apologies for the very limited response.
I think I might ask one last question regarding your guest book project. Just because I think it's important to think of your activity which introduces narratives into some kind of healing or just practical application. So could you tell just a few words?
Okay, well, in very few words, because I know how exhausted everybody must be if I engage here in cathartic identification with everybody suffering out there, with the noise and the heat, 2 hours of constant talk. Yeah, in 2 words, what I and some colleagues are trying to do is work with young people in a number of divided cities. At the moment it's Jerusalem, Mitrovica in the Balkans, and Derry, London, Derry in Northern Ireland. And to encourage them to engage in a kind of a threefold narrative pedagogy project, where they begin by going to their respective communities. For example, Northern Ireland, where I'll be working next week, the Catholic students go to their families, parents, grandparents, and they study their history as to why the walls of Derry represent for them, the Protestant, Unionist, British community, liberty, emancipation, democracy. Everything that the Catholics wanted to take away from them. And they are the victims of this siege that the Catholic majority of Ireland has been waging against them for 500 years. And they've kept the flame of the true Protestant Reformed faith alive. So then the Catholics are invited to go back and get their version of the story. Why would they be thrown out of the city? When the settlers came in, they were sent to the bogside and have been victimized and gerrymandered and tortured and maimed ever since, right up to the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. So they learn from their grandparents and their parents. And of course, there's a saying in Ireland, if you want to know what happened, ask your grandfather. If you want to know what people say happened, ask your grandmother. And of course, you need both. The facts, so-called, if ever there are facts, and then the interpretation of the facts. So there's that work of reconstruction. That's phase one. Phase two, to speed things up, is when they meet together and they share, they show each other their stories and they listen to their respective stories. Because a lot of these things are taboo. And these stories act themselves out in generations of violence and hatred and fear and resentment, and even the schools are still denominationally divided, 80% of them. And this is what, 12 years more after the peace agreement. There's still Protestants, Catholics. So that's phase two. They witness each other's stories, and then phase three is they're invited to reimagine in a contemporary context the characters and events that are contained in their respective narratives by crossing narratives and reinventing a new one. And that's where their creative narrative imagination comes into play. And they have poetic license. They're in the realm of as if. Just give one other example. I won't go into Mitrovica, where the Serbian students and the Kosovar Albanian Muslim students recount the narratives and myths of the Battle of Kosovo. And as you know, this divided the Baltics and has led to conflicts between the Islamic and Christian civilizations ever since, at least in that part of the world. I won't go into that. But a third one is recently a Palestinian and an Israeli. And they came together in groups. There's an embargo at the moment, which is very sad, where Palestinian students are not allowed to actually talk to Israeli students. And Israeli students, once they go into the army, are not allowed to talk to Palestinians. So it's tough to get around this, and I won't go into the ways in which we've been able to do it, or try to do it. But one of the stories I found very interesting was the recounting of Mount Moriah, where in the Jewish version, Isaac is the favorite son, whereas in Islam, Ishmael is the favorite son. So they both go through their respective hadiths, they go back to the original text, the Quranic and the Torah, and then the respective hadiths, and then what their parents and grandparents and what the West Bank says about it and what North Jerusalem says about it. And then they share the stories with each other. A lot of that is done on the internet because it's so hard for them to actually cross the walls of Jerusalem, the streets. And then thirdly, they reinvent, which is what they're doing now, a story where the two brothers come together in contemporary Jerusalem. And that's where imagination gives a future to the past by exploring possibilities. And as Ricard says, l'imaginaire ne connaît pas de censure. Imagination knows no censorship. So the reconversion of history, once you acknowledge what it was and the different interpretations of it as past, as memory, if you can then reopen that in the future as a free variation on possibles, that can lead potentially to forms of forgiveness and healing. But it's not easy, and there's so many taboos and so many obstacles that it's not easy at all. And I'll just end with a little story which was one of the reasons I first did guest book. And I'm sometimes asked about why I did it, and I say because I grew up in Northern Ireland where people were killing each other. And so I felt we needed to work on this theme of hostility being converted into hospitality, which is impossible, but it can happen. Bishop Tutu and Mandela, in South Africa, the truth tribunals in Northern Ireland and in Rwanda, it's work going on. Impossible work, but things are still happening. And where I was very moved to do something was when I witnessed the power of story in a workshop that I was engaged in the 1980s between ex-paramilitary prisoners in Northern Ireland. So you have the IRA, Republican Catholic prisoners, and you have UDA, Loyalist Protestant prisoners. And they were coming together for this workshop in a conference called Beyond Hate. And I was just engaged in monitoring and sharing one of these. And a prisoner from the IRA stood up and he said, I was nearly shot. He said, I'm lucky to be alive because about 8 years ago, I was asleep in my bed and the UDA burst into my room, took me, blindfolded me, bundled me into the back of a car, brought me to a barn, and tied me up, and there was a gun to my head, and I knew that I was going to die. So I asked my assassin if he'd give me a cigarette. So he did. I didn't think he would, but he did. The impossible thing, he gave me a cigarette. So he said, as I was smoking the cigarette, I told him why I had become a member of the IRA, and why I planted bombs, and why I killed Protestants. And I told him how my father had been taken out of his bed, as I had just been taken out, and taken to a barn, and blindfolded, and shot in 6 places, starting at the feet, working up to his neck. I told him how my mother had had a nervous breakdown, had then become a prostitute, and finally committed suicide. I told him how my brother had suffered from a psychotic breakdown, and then had entered the IRA and been taken out and shot, and tortured in unspeakable ways. And I basically said that having witnessed all this, and having suffered much myself from British brutality in Bloody Sunday, and then the denial that it ever happened, from loyalist paranoia, etc., and seeing the people who I loved most suffer, I had no alternative but go out and defend my community and kill those I hated. So anyway, cigarette went out, that was it, waited for the gun to go off, silence. So we waited. 10 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour. Silence. Eventually he got free, looked around, there was nobody there. He walked out of the bar. He was picked up by the police a week later and put into long-cash prison. Finished his story, and another man stood up at the back of the room and he said, "I was your assassin." And the reason I didn't kill you was very simple. It was because when I heard your story, I realized it was my story. And in that moment, they then shook hands, but there was a chill, you know, that ran up my spine because I felt there was a breakthrough. They had exchanged narratives. They had heard each other. The fact that he was blindfolded was very important. If they were face to face, they would have shot each other. But the fact that it was pure hearing, and there was a vulnerability of hearing. The guy had literally what? How long does it take to smoke a cigarette? 2 minutes, 3 minutes? And he smoked it very slowly. But still, you know, somebody is utterly vulnerable in telling. They're not going to tell lies at that point in their life, but there was something in the vulnerability of telling the story and the story being heard that turned generations of repeated violence, compulsive obsessional violence, revenge, resentment, fear, victimization, into I let you live. And they shook hands and they worked together, you know, with other youth groups ever since, in their own small, you know, quiet, inconspicuous way. So, you know, it's witnessing something going on like that on the ground that makes you say, well, you know, then at a larger level, when Tutu and Mandela shake hands with their perpetrators, when John Hume shakes hands with Jerry Adams, the leader of the IRA, then impossible things can happen at a larger level. But it's at the smaller micro level that one sees these petits miracles taking place, and that gives one hope, even if all the odds are stacked against us.
I think it's a wonderful story to end up.